Hi folks, my name is Hugo Olaiz. I'm in my home in Oxford, Ohio with Dr. John Charles Duffy,
who hates being called doctor,
and who also happens to be my husband. John Charles, why don't you say something about yourself?
I teach American religious history at Miami University here in Oxford.
And I myself work for Forward Movement, which is an agency of the Episcopal Church. A big part of my job is to translate, and I am the author of the most recent Spanish translation of the Book of Common Prayer for the Episcopal Church. So, John Charles, we have here something called the First Nations Version. This is a book published in 2021 by an evangelical
InterVarsity Press, yeah.
By an evangelical press, and the subtitle says, An Indigenous Translation of the New Testament. Even though it comes from 2021, we just discovered it, correct?
Yes.
And we wanted to make a short video, just making some comments about the peculiar things that we found. It will be very simple, very light, and hopefully informative for you guys. All right, John Charles, should we just dive into some of the things? Should I mention some of the...
Yeah, what grabbed you?
Well, many things. Let me say something in terms of theoretical framework. I wrote my master thesis on some aspects of the New Testament translation, 1569 Spanish translation of the New Testament by Casiodoro de Reina. And one of the people that I quote is two folks who, Bigman and Callow, who published in 1974 a book called Translating the Word of God. And they deal a little bit with this issue of cultural equivalence and cultural adaptations. And the context of this is, of course, translating the Bible, and particularly translating the Bible to remote cultures, what in the old days we used to call exotic languages.
So a lot of indigenous people.
Yes, and but from around the world, not from America, not only from the Americas, but also from around the world. And there's a school, and there's people in the last century, particularly, starting in the 1940s, with Eugene Nida, who pretty much established some of the guiding principles that Bible translators should use.
There's an institution named for Wycliffe, I believe, who does a lot of this work of translating Bibles for indigenous peoples, and they were involved in this project as well.
All right, very good. And one of the concepts that Callow and Bigman state is that cultural equivalence and cultural references should only be used when they are for didactic purposes, right? So if you're telling a parable, or if you're using a metaphor or an image that doesn't work in the target language, you can adapt it, but never on historic references, right? So if Jesus is walking with his apostles and they are grabbing wheat or grain from a field and proceeding to eat that grain on that field, you cannot go to an exotic culture where there's no wheat and say that Jesus and his apostles were walking through a field
of bananas, right?
Yeah.
But on the other hand, if Jesus is telling a parable or using a metaphor where he says, I am the vine, you are the branches, you could, by this rule, translate that so that Jesus now becomes the vine on which the bananas grow instead of grapes.
Yes. So let's say right now that I think that this, the purpose of this translation goes really beyond what Eugene Nida or Bigman and Callow in the 1970s would have allowed as translations, you know, and this has to do more with what they call a version, right?
The reason being that in this project, the goal of which was to try to create a version of the Bible that was more enculturated, I guess, as people say, that would be more reflective of the cultures of Native Americans, especially pre-colonial. They've done a lot of this kind of translation where, well, we'll look at some examples in a second, but the point is they haven't done it only in the didactic settings, only in the parables. They've also done it in recounting what are supposed to be historical events in the New Testament. Should we use some examples?
Yes.
Yeah, so let's go to an example of where they do this in a parable. I think you liked the parable of the prodigal son, yes?
Yes.
Okay, so that's Luke 15, and let's take a look at how they do that. One thing to signal right off the bat, by the way, is that something that jumps out immediately when you open this translation is that all of the names of the biblical characters have been re-rendered into what are supposed to be their literal meanings in Hebrew or Greek or whatever the language is. So, for example, Jesus is always called Creator Sets Free on the ground that the name Jesus in Hebrew is supposed to mean, I think, God saves, right? And so you will always see Creator Sets Free as the name of Jesus, and then in really a smaller font in parentheses, they put the name Jesus, so that I guess the rest of us know who's being talked about.
And they would do this not only with Hebrew names, but also with Greek names, with Latin names.
With names of places. So the Romans are always, for example, the people of iron. Jerusalem is always village of peace, and so on. As
a translator, if I may add, I think some of these explanations, sometimes we don't have the etymology of a word. So this can be speculative to a certain degree.
It's also, I would point out, it's also at some points kind of imaginative. So, for example, there are multiple figures in the New Testament named Mary, but they don't always render that person's name the same way. So Mary, the mother of Jesus, if I recall correctly, is always called bitter tears, but Mary Magdalene is called strong tears, and Mary of Bethany, the sister of Lazarus, there's some other adjective that precedes tears. So they're trying to distinguish between the characters. But again, like bitter versus strong versus whatever they use for Mary of Bethany, that's not embedded in the language itself. That's them like making.
So there's a creative process to get to this name.
Yeah.
All right.
So back to Luke 15. So Creator Sets Free is telling a story. And the story is about, of course, we know the story of the son who wants his share of the inheritance and goes away. And one of the things that you had liked was this part here. The time came when there was not enough food in the land for everyone. And he, this is the son, found himself poor and hungry. So he went to work for a rancher who set him out to feed the pigs.
This is very, very peculiar, right? And particularly coming from a conservative institution, right? Because I see there almost like a woke message of what happens when Native Americans have to go to white ranchers, right? Mm-hmm. Am I reading too much, do you think?
I don't think so. I mean, because I think it's usually translated as farmer or maybe herder or something. But yeah, when you say rancher, I think that immediately evokes, right, the American history of whites moving in, especially in the western part of the United States and taking over the land and wanting to crowd nomadic Native peoples out of it. So yeah, the history of tension between ranchers and Native Americans, I think immediately gets evoked here in an interesting way. And then later on, when the son decides to go home, here's another example of the kind of enculturation they do, in a way that, in this case, would be considered acceptable by the principle of the translators that you were talking about. So when the son goes home, let's read what he says. The son said, "Father, I have failed the spirit world above, heaven, and you, I am not worthy to be called your son." But the father ignored his son's words, turned to his servants and said, "Go, find my best regalia and put it on him. Give him a headdress of feathers for his head and new moccasins for his feet." Now, do you remember what it says in the way it's usually translated in English?
Well, I think he gives him the best robe, a ring, and sandals.
A ring for his finger and sandals for his feet. But here the ring has become a feather headdress for the head, and the sandals have become, not too surprisingly, moccasins. The transition from ring to feather headdress is a more dramatic one.
Yeah. All right. Should we go to a historic example?
Yeah, let's go to...
Should we go to Luke
There's a couple things we look at. Let's go to the story of Jesus' nativity in Luke 2. Now, one thing this translation does is when they start taking real major liberties, they do signal that with either placing words in italics, or in some cases, can you show this to the
Yes,
screen?
it will take a minute.
You'll actually see where there is text in a different font with a gray bar next to it,
What would be an example?
like right there at the bottom of the page. So the text there in the sans serif font, the italics with the gray bar next to it, is actually like a narrative addition that the translators have added, and they do this a lot to try to make the story more lively and vivid, which again, I guess is part of their effort to enculturate this into more of a native style. So this is about, let's read some of this so you get a feel for, in some ways, how clunky the language can get because of what they do. So, this is Mary and Joseph on their way to Bethlehem. He gives sons, Joseph, and bitter tears, Mary, set out on a long village from seed planter village, Nazareth, in circle of nations, Galilee, to house of bread, Bethlehem, in the land of promise, Judea, the village of their ancestor, the great chief, much loved one, David. Now they then shift to their narrative edition in italics, and they say, the journey took several long days and cold nights, as they traveled over high hills and through the dry desert. When they arrived, tired and weary, they entered the crowded village. And now we resume the biblical text. The time came for bitter tears, Mary, to have her child was upon her. But no place could be found in the lodging house. So he gives sons, Joseph, found a sheep cave, where it was warm and dry. There she gave birth to her son. They wrapped him in a soft, warm blanket and laid him on a baby board. Then they placed him on a bed of straw in a feeding trough. Now, the words, and laid him on a baby board, are italicized. They're acknowledging that's not a detail in the original. It's a detail, of course, that immediately evokes, I don't know exactly how widespread this was among Indigenous American cultures, but there are certainly cultures I'm aware of where babies would be bound to a board. And so they're having Jesus wrapped in a blanket, that's the swaddling clothes, but then bound to a board, that's not in the biblical text, and then laid in the manger. And so that would not be consistent with the rule you were talking about, because they're actually transferring the original historical context, the original cultural context of what's supposed to be a historical event, and transforming it to now occupy a different cultural context. That's more of a free kind of thing.
Very interesting. All right, very good.
Another version of that, where they sort of inject cultural elements not in the original text into a historical story, would be the triumphal entry. Do you want to look at that?
Let's look at the triumphal entry. I believe it's in several Gospels.
We're going to look at Mark chapter 11.
All right.
So Jesus sends his followers to Jerusalem to set up a place for the Passover. And they bring back the young donkey. They brought the young donkey to Creator Sets Free, Jesus, and laid their deer skins and Pendleton blankets on the colt. And then he sat down upon it. A crowd gathered around, and some of them laid their buffalo robes on the road, while others spread out branches with large leaves they had cut from the fields. And again, they acknowledge the importation into the text by italicizing the words deerskins and Pendleton blankets, and also the word buffalo and the phrase buffalo robes. But again, that's something that your translators would have said was a no-no.
What is Jesus riding?
He's riding, in this case, a donkey, a colt.
A colt or donkey?
Yeah.
Okay, all right.
Were you thinking they might have changed that to something else?
Well, I was thinking, because very conservative Christians like to say that it was both a donkey and...
Yeah, and I think it depends on whose version you're reading. Where there's one version where there's both a donkey with the colt accompanying the donkey. Yeah.
Is the colt donkey? Yeah.
In this case, it's just the colt. They only
just
have the colt.
All right. Very good. All right. Very interesting. What's going on here? Are you going to talk about Was it Matthew 23:37?
Yeah, that'd be another example of where they take, let's read it, and then you can comment on whether or not this would be considered acceptable by the rule that had been laid down by the translators you studied.
All right.
So this is Jesus. This is chapter 23 of Matthew. Jesus is outside Jerusalem, and he says this. First, we get one of those narrative additions they like to do from time to time. A dark cloud cast a shadow over Creator sets free, and a look of pain and sorrow came upon his face. And now we get to the biblical verse. Jerusalem, O village of peace, he cried out loud for all to hear. You who kill the prophets and stone to death the ones sent to you, how I have longed to gather your children together like an eagle gathers her young under her wings, but you would not have it.
Right. Well, so it's interesting because it's an image, it's a metaphor, and the idea is that you have permission to change images and metaphors so long as they are merely didactic, right?
Okay.
But what I learned as a little boy going to Sunday school was that the reason why Jesus talks about the hen gathering the chicks under her wings is precisely to protect those chicks from eagles and perhaps from other
hawks and so on.
Yeah, from other predators. So this is very interesting what they did, right? Because, okay, yes, the eagle also has chicks, but I don't know. I guess we can imagine that they also need protection from something. I don't know,
and there is, I suppose, a liability when you start to do this kind of cultural transformation, right? I mean, they clearly think, the people who did this change clearly think that an eagle gathering its chicks under its wings is equivalent to a chicken gathering its chicks under its wings. But what you're pointing out is that it might not be. The image could potentially then start yielding different kinds of interpretations.
Is there possibly a humorous, unwanted, or unintended effect on using this technique?
That's an interesting question, and of course that will depend on your audience. I will say that as I was going through this book, there was a lot of this that I found humorous in a way they did not intend because it was so jarring. For example,
Are you going to give us an example?
for example, the parable, the Jesus' proverb about it's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than a rich man enter the kingdom of heaven. That becomes a moose passing through the eye of a needle. Or the one about straining at gnats swallowing camels, again, becomes straining at gnats swallowing a moose. And yeah, I laughed at that because it was just such a jarring image. But of course, that just has to do with the fact that it's unfamiliar to me. What that would mean to particularly a native person reading this is a different question, right?
Okay. When I wrote my master thesis, I talked about several categories. One is institutions, one is buildings. Let's talk a little bit about buildings, right?
You're thinking of the passage in Ephesians?
Yes, there's a famous passage in Ephesians in which...
So we should read that passage in English first.
Okay.
So this is Ephesians 2, and what you want is 19 through 22. Ephesians 2, 19 through 22. And let's see what the metaphor is in the English translation, which I'm presuming is closer to the metaphor in the Greek than what we're going to have here. Galatians, Ephesians comes afterward.
What verses?
Ephesians 2, 19 through 22.
My recollection is that we have an imagery here that Paul uses comparing the church with a building. So then you are no longer strangers or aliens, but you are citizens with the saints and also members of the household of God, built upon the foundation of the apostles and prophets, with Christ Jesus himself as a cornerstone. In him the whole structure is joined together and grows into a holy temple in the Lord. 22. In whom you also are built together spiritually into a dwelling place for God.
Okay, so the metaphor there is a temple. We are the temple. We, the lay members, are resting on a foundation.
Okay.
That foundation consists of the apostles, and Jesus is the cornerstone.
All right.
So it's a metaphor in which they are at the base and we're at the top.
Okay.
Let's see how that metaphor gets transformed here. Now we are all his holy people and members of one new nation. No one is on the outside of this great family that our Father is creating. We are all related to one another and initiated into Creator's lodge that is built together with wooden poles, the message bearers, apostles, and prophets of old. Creator sets free, Jesus, is the main pole binding us together, like branches being weaved into his sacred lodge. Joined together in this way, we become a dwelling place for his Spirit.
All right.
Your thoughts?
I find it very creative, and sometimes it's useful to rethink the imagery and the metaphors that appear in the Bible. I think it's very powerful. I actually think it works. Yeah, I think it has a lot of creative power. I'm quite impressed because it's something that I guess we all understand, right? Even if we are not Native Americans. Now, of course, a building, the foundation is a little bit different, right? If a wind comes, you want a strong foundation, right?
And certainly in that sense, the metaphor has changed, right? So instead of like the apostles and Jesus being the base that we're built on top of, now Jesus is the center, and the apostles are somewhere
Like
else. It's not really clear anymore, but they're wooden poles elsewhere.
Yeah, around. You can imagine a teepee, for example, with all the...
If anything, I mean, I can imagine that from the point of view of like a liberal theology, this actually might be a more appealing version of the image, because it's less... Because it requires you to imagine everything being woven together, right? And so it kind of is more... It's less hierarchical, it's less vertical than you have in the original image.
Yeah, it's not as, going through horizontal, layers.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Very, very interesting. I think it's one of the most... one of the things that I really like, that I deserve praising, in my opinion.
Let's talk about the Lord's Prayer for a second. Because that's another place where they take some pretty strong liberties, and we can see whether you like what they did or not. So let's go to Matthew's version of the Lord's Prayer. All right. And we're looking at the line that, in the English translation we mostly know, is, "Give us today our daily bread."
All right.
Give us today our daily bread. That's 7 words. And 7 words become a whole paragraph here, which reads as follows. Provide for us day by day the elk, the buffalo, and the salmon, the corn, the squash, and the wild rice, all the things we need for each day.
All right.
First of all, would that be acceptable by your translator's rule? I guess it would, because it's didactic, right?
I guess
it's not saying they went somewhere to eat bread and someone put a salmon.
Literally,
right,
yeah.
Okay.
Bread stands for something else.
Right.
Okay.
It's very elaborate, though, right? I mean, and at that point, this isn't really a translation anymore.
No,
I mean, this is almost a commentary in a way.
Yes, it's a cultural...
It's a much more elaborate sort of riffing around the passage. Although I can imagine there might be people who would really value that in a liturgical setting.
Yeah, well, I can imagine Episcopal congregations with Native Americans that would use this with permission of the bishops, and in regular...
Or non-native majority white congregations doing it to create a sense of solidarity with Native peoples.
Yeah. All right. And we didn't mention anything about the elements that Jesus blesses in the Last Supper, right?
So it's pretty tame what they do with it. Wine stays wine.
Okay.
Bread becomes fry bread.
Fry bread.
That's kind of a routine change. References to bread always become fry bread.
All right. And that would break the rules of Gallo and Bigman.
Because the historical bread wasn't fried bread.
Yeah, it wasn't fried, one would assume. All right. Well, there's one that really made me laugh. I found humorous, and you know what it is, right?
So there's a couple things in Revelation. I think that's where we are.
Yeah.
Okay, let's look at 2 things in Revelation. So this is Revelation chapter 3. Jesus, or Creator sets free, is saying to John, or what is John's name here? This John's name is He Shows Goodwill.
Okay.
So, Creator Sets Free says to He Shows Goodwill, I stand before the entrance of your teepee, asking you to welcome me in. Now, that is, in English translation, typically...
I think it follows the rules, right? Because it's a metaphor. It's not literally Jesus standing
at the door and knocking.
The question is, there's no door there, right?
No, of course not. Right. So he just has to stand at the edge of the teepee and ask to be welcome.
He can knock. He cannot knock, right? So, okay, right. Okay. And then
the one that really made you laugh is this. This is from Revelation chapter 22. It's the description of the new heaven and new earth and the new Jerusalem.
Do you want me to read in English first, or?
I actually don't remember what the English version of this image is. I mean, I think I know what it is. But so it's chapter 22, verse 4. Take a look at it.
Do you want it?
So this is the part that's saying that, the redeemed will be in the New Jerusalem and life will be wonderful. There will be no more suffering and death, and God will wipe away all the tears from their faces. And so chapter 22, verse 4.
They will see his face, and his name will be on their foreheads.
Okay, this is actually eerily similar. They will see his face, and his name will be tattooed on their foreheads.
All right. And we would assume that what they are trying to do here is to more or less, not to go to a specific nation, but trying to be somehow, I don't know, in a vague way perhaps, try to include cultural aspects of the life of different nations, right?
And there's a challenge in the book because, Native Americans, of course, were not homogenous in their culture. And there are some times in the book where they will insert a cultural reference that they're anticipating will be more familiar to people of some tribes than others. And so there'll actually be a footnote explaining this is from the Apaches and the Southeastern peoples, this is from the Plains peoples, and they'll actually explain, even to native readers, presumably, what that image means.
So can we assume that perhaps some of these nations do practice some traditional forms of tattooing their skin? Would there be an explanation of...
I guess it would have to be, yeah.
Okay, all right. Yeah. We're not imagining the new youth of
nations. I have to say, the embrace of tattooing is really interesting in light of the politics of body modification among evangelicals. I mean, there are white evangelicals in this country who disapprove of tattooing, right?
Yeah.
But these folks seem to be fine with it.
All right.
One observation I'd like to make about this.
All right.
Which is that, they say in the preface to the book that they basically field tested this with native readers who said that they very much appreciated the book. And, if there are native people who value this way of enculturating their biblical text, good and well. One worry I do have about this project is I wonder if, for white evangelicals who look at this project, there may be a certain lingering colonialist notion that for indigenous peoples, you have to do this kind of importing of cultural elements because white evangelicals have this lingering colonialist assumption that indigenous peoples are simple and are not capable of doing the intellectual work that we white people do when we are reading about a text from Middle Eastern culture and we learn to understand that culture. These people, they're not going to understand what grapes are, so you got to plug in bananas, that kind of thing.
See.
That is something that I find potentially troubling about this project.
Yeah, some of the commentaries and additions struck me as perhaps aiming to, I was thinking teenagers, perhaps, sometimes with sexual references being toned down, in my opinion, right? So, yeah, it's hard to know. What happens when Jesus asks Peter if he loves him?
And at the end of the Gospel of John, Jesus asks Peter, "Do you love me?" And Peter says, "Of course I love you. Feed my sheep." In this, it gets rendered as, "Do you love me as a friend?"
Well, one wonders, on the one hand, it could be homophobic, a fear there. On the other hand, it could be that the concept of friend is so, ingrained in some of the native, nations that, in a way that we don't quite understand. I don't
So rather than toning it down, you're saying it might actually intensify.
Yes. All right. Well, Joe Charles, thank you so much for this time. I think we had a good time yesterday reading this new edition of the New Testament and now commenting it.
Right.